After my husband's funeral, my son drove me to a remote road and said, "This is where you get out. The house and the business are mine now." I stood in the dust, clutching my purse, while he drove away without looking back. No phone, no money. And that's when I realized I wasn't alone. I was free, but he had no idea what I had done before his father died. The sun stood still over Prescott, Arizona, casting its heavy gaze upon the graveyard where the earth had just swallowed the last breath of Frank Ellis. The mourners had thinned out, their condolences fading into the hush of the desert wind. Only Margaret remained, sitting on the edge of the wooden bench beneath the trembling shadow of a pine tree, hands clasped and gaze fixed on the fresh mound of soil that now marked the final chapter of marriage that had lasted 41 years. She did not cry. Not because the grief wasn't real. It pressed against her chest like a rock that would not budge, but because something deeper held the tears at bay. It wasn't numbness. It wasn't shock. It was something else. A stillness. A silence. Her son, Jason, had left early, blaming a call from the firm. He hadn't held her hand during the burial, nor met her eyes as they threw Frank's favorite Stetson into the grave before the final shovel of dirt covered it. He had muttered something vague about handling the family business now, as if inheritance were a transaction and not a burden soaked in memory. For days after the funeral, the house grew colder, not just in temperature but in spirit. Frank's study, with its dark mahogany furniture and heavy curtains, had always felt like a throne room. Now it was locked. Jason had taken the keys, insisting that things would be simpler if she took a break from business affairs. Margaret didn't argue. Not yet. On the 5th day, Jason suggested they take a drive. "Just to clear our heads," he said. "Let's get away for a bit." Margaret, dressed in a simple navy blue cardigan and slacks, followed him silently to the car. It was an unfamiliar model, sleek and new, unlike Frank's old pickup. Jason barely spoke during the drive, tapping endlessly on his phone, occasionally glancing at her with a look that tried to mimic concern but landed closer to calculation. They drove farther than she expected, past Chino Valley, past the ghost towns with their skeletal saloons. The road became dust and gravel. Cactuses watched in silence. When the car finally stopped, they were surrounded by nothing but low brush and the endless blue dome of Arizona sky. Jason stepped out, walked around, and opened the door on her side. "Stretch your legs, Mom," he said. "Take a walk. Breathe a little." Margaret hesitated but stepped out, drawn by some instinct deeper than suspicion. She turned to speak, but before a word left her lips, she heard the car door slam. Tires spun, scattering dust and rock. The engine roared away. She stood there for a moment, wind tousling her graying hair, dust stinging her eyes. She looked down at her purse. No phone, no wallet, only a small metal case with a few toiletries and a pen. Jason must have slipped it into the bag last minute. The betrayal didn't crash down all at once. It didn't come in screaming winds or pounding heartbeats. It came like a hush of snowfall in the desert, quiet, impossible, surreal. But then Margaret Ellis did something she hadn't done in weeks. She smiled, not because she was lost, but because she wasn't, because she had suspected this moment might come, because she had prepared. She turned away from the direction Jason had gone and began to walk, the low sun casting long shadows of her figure across the gravel path. With every step, the fog around her thoughts began to lift. For decades, she had been Frank Ellis's wife, Jason Ellis's mother. She had poured her mind into gardens and books, had smiled in silence during business dinners, had played the perfect supporting role. But Margaret was never passive. Not really. Far down the winding road, a rusted green pickup approached slowly, trailing a ribbon of dust. The driver was an older man, face bronzed by sun, eyes hidden behind mirror glasses. The truck pulled over beside her. "You need a ride, ma'am?" he asked. Margaret glanced into the cab, saw a faded Jesus bobblehead on the dashboard, and nodded once. She opened the door and climbed in without hesitation. "You headed anywhere in particular?" She turned to him, voice calm, steady. "Yes, I need to get to a place where I left everything ready." The man raised an eyebrow. "You sure about that?" She smiled again, this time with a quiet certainty. Never been more sure. As they drove, the desert stretched endlessly in every direction. The radio crackled low with an old Johnny Cash tune. Margaret leaned back in the seat, closed her eyes, and let the rhythm of the road sink with her thoughts. This wasn't the end. This was the beginning. And her son, in all his arrogance, had just made the worst mistake of his life. She would not call the police. She would not beg for help. She would disappear from the version of her life they thought they controlled, and rise in the one they never even noticed she built. Not as Margaret Ellis, the widow, but as someone else entirely. Someone unstoppable. The sun had nearly sunk below the horizon by the time the green pickup veered off the main road onto a narrow, winding path half swallowed by desert scrub. Margaret sat in contemplative silence, her eyes tracing the contours of distant mountains as if they held the answers to everything unspoken in her life. The driver, whose name she now knew was Bill, didn't ask many questions after their initial exchange. He had a weathered calm about him, the kind of quiet that came from a life lived simply and truthfully. Margaret respected that. As the truck creaked to a stop beside a modest gas station outpost, long abandoned and now covered in graffiti and desert dust, Bill turned to her. "Used to be a checkpoint for cattle herders," he said, pulling the brake. "Not much left now, but I figure you ain't exactly looking for a crowd." Margaret nodded and stepped out. Behind the ruins of the outpost lay a small dirt road leading to an old water tower. To anyone else, it would look like nothing more than desert decay. But to Margaret, it was the edge of the map she had drawn for herself in secret for years. After thanking Bill and watching his taillights disappear into the growing dusk, she made her way around the water tower and followed a narrow path between two rocky hills. There, tucked behind layers of rock and scrub, was a gate, unmarked, silent, and electric. She reached into the lining of her bag, where a thin plastic card was sewn into the seam. With one swipe against a hidden panel in the stone, the gate buzzed open. The land that unfolded before her was not grand, but it was purposeful. A low modern building stood at the center, its structure blending with the earth in a deliberate design. Solar panels lining the roof, satellite equipment barely visible beneath a camouflage shell. Margaret stepped inside. Motion sensors clicked on. Soft lighting illuminated the entry hall, and then footsteps echoed from deeper within. A woman in her 30s, sharp-eyed and confident, approached. "Ma'am," she said, not with surprise, but with deference, "we were told to expect you only in case of an emergency." Margaret took a breath, the first full one in days. "This is that emergency, Natalie. Has the system been maintained?" "Every protocol is operational. The reports are current. The last update came in 3 days ago. We kept everything exactly as you ordered." Margaret followed her through a hallway lined with frosted glass and into a control room where 4 monitors displayed maps, spreadsheets, energy indexes, and legal property registries. It looked more like a strategy center for a high-stakes private firm than anything a so-called housewife should own. But that had always been the illusion, hadn't it? Years ago, when Frank had begun expanding his regional logistics company, Margaret had taken an interest, not in the operations themselves, but in the blind spots. Every land deal passed through attorneys and advisors who never thought to check whose name appeared on the final deed, provided it wasn't Frank's. But Margaret, fluent in the art of invisibility, had slipped through those cracks and built something entirely her own. She registered shell companies under aliases: ME Ventures, Desert Warden Holdings, Crescent Equity. Each one layered over the other like veils, eventually nesting into a trust managed anonymously through a firm in Santa Fe. No one ever looked twice at her long drives into the desert or her garden club investments. Not when she wore pearls and brought pies to church events. She walked to the central console and pulled up the latest report. There they were, 12 parcels of land, each now strategically valuable thanks to the state's aggressive push into solar energy development. 6 of those parcels were directly adjacent to roads Jason had convinced the Ellis Company to pave, believing they would become future routes for expanding his logistics network. "Do we have the state offers in writing?" Margaret asked. Natalie handed her a tablet. 2 confirmed bids, one from Sunhaven Energy, the other from Eclipse Corp. They've done preliminary testing and believe these plots will be perfect for battery fields. They had no idea we owned them. "Good. Let them keep guessing," Margaret said, her voice firm. Later that night, alone in a small suite behind the facility, Margaret stood in front of a long mirror. She removed the earrings she had worn at the funeral, carefully placing them in a black velvet box. Then, for the first time in decades, she opened a drawer containing a sealed envelope marked simply with a red ink stamp, Plan Phoenix. Inside was a key. A different life had lived in secret within her all along, not out of rebellion, but out of necessity. Margaret had once believed she could steer her family quietly from the background, but time had taught her that silence does not always grant control. Sometimes silence is mistaken for weakness, and now that Jason had revealed the depth of his ambition and cruelty, he had unintentionally activated the plan she had crafted in painstaking detail. She remembered when it began. Frank had dismissed her from every financial meeting, Jason echoing his father's tone by the time he was a teenager. But instead of resenting it, Margaret had watched, listened, studied. Every man who had underestimated her had handed her a tool, a name, a connection, a loophole, and she had used them all. Back in the control room the next morning, Margaret sat with Natalie and 3 other core staff members, each one handpicked over the past 15 years. A data analyst who used to work for the Department of Energy, a retired accountant who had quietly uncovered fraud for Fortune 500 companies, and a lawyer from Nevada who specialized in land acquisition under federal radar. "I want everything Jason has touched in the last 2 years reviewed," Margaret instructed. "Every transfer, every loan, every joint venture. Find the pressure points." The lawyer, a tall, thin man with silver-rimmed glasses, tapped on his laptop. "We've already started. It appears he borrowed heavily against the Prescott warehouse, believing it was increasing in value thanks to nearby developments. And he doesn't know those developments were ours," Natalie added. "The titles are buried in our 3rd-tier shell." Margaret looked out the window, where the desert stretched endlessly, open, raw, and wild, just like the future she was building. "Then it's time," she said. "Time to let him feel the ground shift." She rose, brushed the dust from her sleeves, and added, "Draft a letter, but don't send it from me. Send it from ME Equity Holdings." Natalie hesitated. "No signature?" Margaret shook her head. "Only the initials. Let him wonder. Let him try to remember who used to sign his school permission slips." She smiled again, not the bitter smile of revenge, but the steady smile of a woman who had waited, worked, and watched. Now, everything was ready, and Jason was already playing on a board she had built. The hum of the private jet faded behind Margaret as she stepped off the tarmac in Tucson, her feet touching down on familiar ground with composure that belied the storm she was about to unleash. She wore no disguise, no attempt to cloak her identity, because she knew that no one in the city truly saw her anymore. That had always been her advantage. People remembered the outline of her silhouette at charity galas, her quiet presence in boardrooms, the supportive wife clapping from the back row. They had never looked past that, but they would now. She had returned not to plead or reclaim, but to reposition herself, openly, powerfully, and with precision. Her first stop was a warehouse on the outskirts of the city, nestled in an industrial park long considered obsolete. Inside, a transformation had taken place. The cavernous space had been stripped to its bones and rebuilt with glass offices, rows of monitors, and a quiet efficiency that hummed like a heartbeat. The sign above the main entrance read, "Only ME Consultoria." Her staff, previously working under pseudonyms and indirect management, stood in silent recognition as she entered. The oldest among them, a woman named Carla who had once been Margaret's personal assistant 2 decades ago, approached with eyes slightly moist. "You're really here," she said, her voice a near whisper. "After all this time." "I'm not here to visit," Margaret replied, her tone steady. "This is a return. And this time we move openly." In the conference room, reports were already waiting. Jason's recent land dealings, his shell partnerships with opportunistic real estate groups, and, most critically, his plans to broker a deal with an international logistics firm that would have consolidated what remained of Frank Ellis's legacy into foreign hands. The move was reckless, short-sighted, and entirely built on assets that no longer belonged to him. "He doesn't know the ownership structure of half the land he's selling," said Carla, tapping her pen against the spreadsheet. "He thinks they're still tied to Ellis Freight Holdings." Margaret leaned over the table, scanning the figures. "Let's confirm the title chain on plot 14. That one's going to be key. It's held through Sandridge Trust, which reports to Crescent Equities. And Crescent belongs to us," Margaret concluded. "Make sure the lawyers are ready to intervene when he files the deed." Outside the glass windows, the late afternoon sun turned the desert landscape gold. Margaret paused, staring into the distance, not to reminisce, but to calculate. This was not about vengeance. It was about order. Her husband's empire had been built with brute force and masculine ego. She had no interest in resurrecting it. What she was building was different, surgical, strategic. The next morning, she walked through downtown Tucson in a simple black suit, her silver hair pinned back, her presence no longer passive. She entered the main bank building on Fifth Avenue, the same bank where Jason had recently opened a line of credit. The branch manager, an eager young man named Davis, greeted her with a wide smile and the assumption that she was someone's secretary. "I'm here on behalf of Emmy Equity Holdings," she said, sliding a folder across the desk. "We'd like to verify some liens that were placed against property listed under Ellis Freight Holdings." Davis blinked, thrown off by the firm voice and sharp tone. "Are you with legal?" "I own the entity," she replied, her eyes never leaving his. Inside the folder were documents that proved her financial positioning, land titles, investment patterns, a summary of trust ownerships that traced in clean legal lines back to her name. Davis skimmed through them, his face shifting from professional detachment to quiet shock. "This is extensive," he murmured. "It's only the beginning." Later that day, back at her office, Margaret drafted the letter herself. The language was precise, legal but not cold. It outlined her investment interest in the upcoming development Jason was pursuing and cited conflict clauses based on her existing land holdings. The letter ended with a firm notice of intent to halt any transfers until the rightful ownership was settled. She signed it not as Margaret Ellis, but as Emmy Equity Holdings. The letter arrived on Jason's desk 2 days later. According to her internal contacts still working at Ellis Freight, Jason had reacted with laughter at first. "Who the hell is this?" he'd said, throwing the letter onto the conference table. But the laughter faded as his legal advisor reviewed the content. And then came the silence. The sharp, stunned silence of a man realizing he was not in control. Margaret, meanwhile, made no attempt to contact him. She had no interest in confrontation or apology. Instead, she called a meeting with local developers, including representatives from Sunhaven Energy. The deal she offered them was clean, generous, and entirely separate from the Ellis name. When asked if she had any ties to the family business, she smiled softly and said, "Only in name." By the end of the week, her influence had begun to ripple through the city. Whispers of a mysterious investor with rights to crucial land parcels surfaced in boardrooms and at real estate conferences. Some began to speculate she was a front for an international entity. Others, more clever, started putting the pieces together. In her private study at the edge of the city, Margaret reviewed her next move. The court filing was ready. A formal claim against Jason's attempt to sell property under false pretenses. The legal documents included not only the titles, but internal memos from Jason's team showing they knew the boundaries were unclear. She would not press criminal charges. She would not destroy him publicly. She would do something worse. She would let him drown in his own assumptions. The filing would trigger an embargo on his deal. Investors would flee. Bankers would hesitate. And the illusion of control that Jason had built, on land, on name, on legacy, would begin to erode grain by grain. As she signed the final page, she whispered a phrase she had once only said to herself long ago in silence. They forgot I was in a room. But now they would remember. The courthouse in downtown Tucson was a mosaic of sun-bleached sandstone, glass reflections, and murmuring corridors filled with sharp shoes and sharpened minds. Margaret Ellis stepped into its echoing chambers not as a grieving widow or discarded matriarch, but as a principal stakeholder prepared to dismantle an empire with legal precision. Her heels clicked steadily across the tile floor, her expression composed, her briefcase in hand, not carried by an assistant, but by herself. She needed no adornments. Her presence alone, quiet and assured, disrupted the rhythm of every space she entered. Jason was already inside the courtroom, seated beside his lawyer, a polished man from Phoenix whose reputation for aggression preceded him. Jason leaned back, arms folded, visibly irritated by the formality of the hearing. He believed this would be a procedural annoyance, a technicality he could bat away with confident arrogance. After all, hadn't he spent the last year expanding Ellis Freight into a regional powerhouse? Hadn't he secured interest from a European conglomerate eager to buy into the Southwest Corridor? To him, this hearing was a pebble in his path, easily kicked aside. Then Margaret walked in. His posture changed immediately. His fingers tapped restlessly on the table. His lawyer leaned in to whisper something, and Jason nodded sharply, refusing to look directly at her. He hadn't seen her in weeks, not since the day he left in the desert, imagining he'd never have to again. The judge entered, and the room came to order. What followed was not dramatic. No outbursts, no raised voices. But what it lacked in theatrics, it made up for in devastating clarity. Margaret's attorney began by submitting the full ownership documentation of the disputed property, deeds, tax records, and trust filings that led, layer by layer, to Emmy Equity Holdings. The court reviewed the legitimacy of her claims in silence, while Jason's legal team attempted to raise questions about the timing and transparency of the transactions. But the paper trail was meticulous, clean, indisputable. Then came the internal emails, obtained by Margaret through quiet sources still loyal to her. Messages exchanged between Jason's development team, admitting they weren't fully certain of the land boundaries, but that no one would contest it, especially not the old woman. That phrase, read aloud in court, hung in the air like a blade. Margaret did not flinch. Jason, however, flushed visibly when the judge addressed her directly. Asking if she would like to make a statement beyond the filings, Margaret stood. She walked calmly to the front, adjusted the microphone, and looked not at the judge but at Jason. There was a time, she began, when I believed that silence and loyalty were the same thing, that if you loved your family, you stood behind them, even in their mistakes, even in their cruelty. I thought my role was to keep things steady, to protect the name, to preserve the illusion. But illusions crumble. And when they do, what remains is the truth. She turned briefly to the judge. Your Honor, I have no interest in destroying Ellis Freight. I built the scaffolding it stood on for years, quietly and without credit. My interest is in preserving what's mine, what I created, what was never theirs to take. Then, facing Jason once more, she said with finality, You inherited the facade, Jason, but I kept the foundation. The courtroom fell into a reverent stillness. Even Jason's lawyer seemed to lower his gaze. When the session concluded, the judge issued a temporary injunction against the sale of the disputed properties and ordered a comprehensive review of all Ellis Freight land, holdings connected to the case. It was a direct hit, not only to Jason's ego, but to the very spine of his expansion plan. Without access to those parcels, his contracts would stall, investors would waver. The cash flow projections he had promised were now illusions themselves. Outside the courthouse, journalists waited with cautious curiosity. They hadn't expected to find the story here, in a quiet civil hearing. But word had already spread. Someone had tipped them off about a shift in the local energy market, about an anonymous investor reshaping the landscape from the shadows. When Margaret stepped outside, microphones reached for her, reporters calling out, Mrs. Ellis, are you planning to reclaim the company your husband founded? Is Emmy Holdings your enterprise? What's your relationship with your son after the day's hearing? Margaret paused. The sun was bright, the air dry, the city stretching before her in vivid contrast to the courtroom's sterility. I'm not here to reclaim anything, she said calmly. I'm here to protect what was mine all along. Then she walked away, not into a car with tinted windows, but down the street alone past the courthouse gates, as though she were simply another citizen going about her day. But the power that followed her steps was unmistakable. Jason, meanwhile, sat behind his office desk that evening, the windows behind him casting long shadows across the empty room. His phone buzzed continuously. Messages from developers, brokers, investors growing nervous. Questions he couldn't answer. Clauses he hadn't read. And always, that single phrase from the courtroom echoing back at him. You inherited the facade. For the first time in his life, he saw the cost of overlooking the quiet power that had lived in the same house with him for over 30 years. And now that power was no longer quiet. It was alive. It was visible. And it was far beyond his reach. Margaret stood alone in the hallway of the house she once called home, the echo of her footsteps bouncing off the familiar walls now stripped of photographs and ornamentation. The silence here no longer carried the weight of grief or absence. It was purposeful now, a silence that marked the end of one life and the deliberate construction of another. She did not hesitate as she moved through the space, her heels firm on the wood floors, each room holding the ghost of who she once was, but no longer commanding her presence. The house would not remain hers for long, not in the way it had been, not as a mausoleum to tradition and hierarchy. It had a future now, one that would serve a different kind of legacy. By the following week, the deed to the Ellis home had been officially transferred from a private family estate into the hands of a non-profit entity, the Phoenix House Initiative. Margaret had founded it quietly under her initials months ago, but now it bore her full name, Margaret Ellen Ellis, and its mission was simple: to provide transitional housing, vocational counseling, and financial literacy programs for women over the age of 50 who had suffered abandonment, financial abuse, or dislocation. The irony was not lost on her that the very walls which once silenced her would now become the corridors of someone else's second chance. The renovation began swiftly. The heavy curtains came down. The old study, once Frank's private sanctuary, was emptied of oppressive furniture and converted into a resource center lined with computers, legal materials, and guides for financial independence. The kitchen was redesigned to serve not one family, but many. Margaret oversaw each step with calm resolve, delegating with clarity, but remaining intimately involved. This was not charity. This was reclamation, for herself and for others like her. Jason had not contacted her since the court ruling, and she had not reached out. The legal consequences of his failure to properly verify the ownership of his projects had begun to snowball. Deals collapsed. Banks demanded clarity he could no longer provide. His arrogance had not shielded him from insolvency. He tried, Margaret knew, to leverage sympathy through quiet channels, asking former allies to mediate, to open dialogue, to soften her hand. But Margaret had no hand extended, not in vengeance, not in spite, but because some lines, once crossed, did not lead back. It was early evening when he appeared unannounced. The sound of gravel under tires echoed across the driveway. Margaret, standing on the front porch beside two construction workers, watched as Jason stepped out of a rental car. He looked smaller somehow, not broken, but weathered in a way she hadn't seen before. Not just in his clothing or the slump of his shoulders, but in his eyes, which no longer carried certainty, only search. "Can we talk?" he asked. She nodded, then gestured for him to follow her around the side of the house, away from the crew and the buzz of renovation. They walked in silence to a bench beneath a sycamore tree that had been planted the year Jason was born. Margaret sat. Jason hesitated, then joined her. "I didn't expect things to end like this," he said. I thought I was doing what Dad would have wanted." Margaret looked at him, her expression steady. "And what about what I would have wanted?" He opened his mouth, then closed it again. "I thought you didn't want to be part of any of it," he finally said. "You never asked." Jason stared at the ground. "I made mistakes. I see that now. But I didn't think you'd cut me out completely. I didn't cut you out, Jason, she replied. You chose a path that didn't include me. I simply stopped following. He looked up at her then, something like regret or maybe recognition, softening his features. You're not going to let me back in, are you? She was quiet for a long moment. Then she answered, not with anger or judgment, but with a calm finality. I forgive you, but no, I won't let you back in. Forgiveness isn't the same as restoration. You need to learn the difference. He nodded slowly, and they sat in silence beneath the tree, the wind moving through its branches like a whisper between timelines. After a while, Jason stood. He offered no final words, no plea. He simply walked back to his car, and when he drove away, Margaret felt no ache of loss, only space. Clear, clean, and earned. That night, she sat on the porch of her small desert cottage on the edge of the new property, watching the horizon shift from orange to purple. The sounds of the city were far behind her now, replaced by the soft hum of crickets and the occasional coyote in the distance. A cup of tea rested beside her, untouched but warm. She gazed out the land, the same land where she had once been abandoned, and now reclaimed on her own terms. Inside, on the desk near the window, rested a photograph of her younger self. It had been taken in secret during one of Frank's company galas, when she'd been smiling politely, unnoticed in the background. She had always thought she looked invisible in it, but now she saw something else. A glint in the eyes, a knowledge, a plan beginning to form. Even then, the photograph would remain on the desk, not as a relic of who she had been, but as a reminder of the strength it took to become who she was now. Not a wife, not a widow, not a victim, but a builder, a founder, a woman whose silence had once been mistaken for absence, and whose presence now reshaped futures. As the stars appeared in the vast Arizona sky, Margaret closed her eyes and let the air fill her lungs. There was no rush, no noise, no need to prove anything anymore. Her life was hers, finally, fully, and in that quiet, steady moment, she felt it, not triumph, not vindication, but something deeper. Peace.